This episode is supported in part by Sacred Wright's public scholarship on religion, gender, and sexuality through a grant from the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation. You can find Sacred Wrights online at sacred-rights.org and the Carpenter Foundation at carpenterfoundation.us. Welcome to Classical Ideas. This is Greg Soden. On this episode, I am delighted to welcome Amar Peterman. Amar Peterman is a constructive theologian working at the intersection of faith and public life. He is the founder of Scholarship for Religion and Society LLC and the former assistant director of civic networks at Interfaith America. Peterman holds an MDiv from Princeton Theological Seminary and is currently a PhD student at the University of Chicago's Divinity School. His writing and research have been featured in Sojourners, Christianity Today, The Christian Century, and more. He also publishes regularly on his Substack, This Common Life. In this episode, we mostly discuss his first book, Becoming Neighbors, The Common Good Made Local, from Eerdmans. It releases March 12th, 2026. A link to check out the book information is included in the show notes. Please enjoy my conversation with Amar Peterman. Amar Peterman, welcome to Classical Ideas.
Thanks for having me.
I'm delighted that you're here. I'm wondering if you can spend a moment and introduce yourself to the listeners out there so they know just a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Yeah, I am a public scholar and theologian working primarily at the intersection of religion and public life. My academic work as a PhD student at the University of Chicago focuses on modern American Christianity and specifically how American Christians appeal to the same doctrinal beliefs, but then use those beliefs in radically different ways, if not entirely against one another, attempting to disprove one another's practices of Christianity. And so I'm trying to get at how doctrine functions when it's put on the ground in specific material contexts. Part of the outworking of that has been this book in a much more approachable and accessible way, not focusing primarily on doctrine, but on visions of the common good. And so, yeah, I am a PhD student. I work at Interfaith America, which is a civic nonprofit based in Chicago, and I've been there for a little over 3 years at this point, where I work primarily now on a project focused on American evangelicalism, which resonates with my own research and personal interests as well. And yeah, apart from those things, I'm a writer, a reader. I live in Milwaukee with my wife and our dog, and we love Milwaukee as a city. I grew up in Green Bay, Wisconsin, and so after a couple years of being away from home for undergrad and then a master's program, it's great to be back in Wisconsin. Not so great on the snowy, cold mornings, but you know the cost we pay to have beautiful summers, and yeah, the community and hospitality that I think Wisconsin brings.
Well, as a resident of Buffalo, New York, also in the Great Lakes, also very snowy, but also with unbeatable summers, I completely feel your situation there, and I share it. Amar, I'd love to know a little bit about your academic and intellectual path. Tell me kind of your journey to finding the area of interest that you've been pursuing for your profession.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard the advice that you shouldn't go into a PhD program unless you have like a burning question that keeps you up at night and you can't help but try to resolve it in one way or another. And I feel like that's been all three of my educational places. I grew up in conservative American Christianity and white megachurch evangelicalism as a brown Indian adoptee, and felt a deep sense of unbelonging there, even though I was on staff as a worship leader and participated in that community as best that I could, and really saw that as the only viable option because others weren't presented to me. And so it's either you're a Christian and you live with this uh, sort of dissonance between you and your faith tradition, or you leave the tradition altogether. Um, I ended up going to Moody Bible Institute, which is an evangelical Bible college in downtown Chicago, ironically, to try to resolve some of that dissonance. I say ironically because Moody is rooted deeply in kind of fundamentalist evangelicalism and very much the same tradition that I had come out of. And yet I was in downtown Chicago. And so I was exposed and introduced to many other practices of Christianity. Some that the school endorsed, others that the school did not want to endorse for their students. But I met people from across the globe in a way that Green Bay never quite afforded the opportunity to do. And in that, learned about liberation theologies, learned about different, I never heard of the main line before. And so I was introduced to Lutherans and Presbyterians, not only in the US, but across the globe. Um, and that experience and those questions and many folks that I met along the way uh, made me reconsider what it would mean to be an evangelical. Um, and I also had questions of, uh, coming out of Moody about what's the role of women in the church? Where do queer people belong in the church? Um, and in a similar way to growing up, I didn't like the answer that I was given, um, which was that women can't be pastors, that queer people don't belong in the church. They're, all these really terrible, really terrible things. Uh, and like, I don't like that answer. I'm not satisfied with that answer, but I don't know what other options could be that haven't been presented to me. And so I ended up on the East Coast at Princeton Seminary, which is a mainline PCUSA seminary. I'm not PCUSA, I'm not mainline. Um, but my intent there was to say, I want to try to figure out more of the breadth of like the big tent of American or Christianity as a whole, let alone American Christianity. Uh, and so I wanted to study with and non-binary professors and professors who denied the resurrection and yet claimed to be a Christian. Um, and I'd study with those professors. The latter, I was not so convinced of why we should deny the resurrection and be Christians. I think the resurrection is a good part of Christian doctrine to hold on to. Um, but in those moments, which is very akin to the book, uh, I was put in close proximity to people who I disagreed with or who had questions about or had made assumptions about, and they were immediately challenged. And so often the path to resolving those questions didn't come through an intellectual assent, but seeing the Spirit work through uh, people who I was told couldn't be Christians or were outside the fold, far more than those very people who were making those claims. And that really changed my relationship to American evangelicalism. And I ended up embarking on a kind of historical project of asking if there was a historical precedent for uh, non-white people to embrace or to employ evangelical doctrine in a way that countered their white evangelical neighbors. Uh, and at the point that I was in seminary, I found a really vibrant examples of that, and was able to at that time reconcile how people in marginalized and minoritized community could faithfully claim the evangelical banner. Even this is in like 2019 to 2022. So the height of COVID, a lot of reckoning with Trump's first term as president and what happened with American evangelicals at that time. Um, my disposition, I'd say, about specifically evangelicalism is admittedly less hopeful than it was in 2022. Uh, but the project continued of asking, how did we get here? It's a similar paradox that I think a lot of Christians and folks broadly in the US are asking, which is how can Christians who claim these beliefs about a loving God, about hospitality and generosity, care, neighbor love, um, seem to be some of the most hate filled and violent folks in our neighborhoods? And I want to get, as a Christian, I have a personal stake in saying, how does that happen, and how do we have less of it? And I think a lot of that has to do with the people and places that form us, and form the way that we approach the scriptures and understand them. And so that's where those burning questions have continued into a PhD program. Uh, and so, yeah, I've studied at evangelical Bible colleges, a mainline seminary, and now I'm at more in a religious studies area at U Chicago, where I'm studying with people across lines of many different faith traditions, and doing so as a theologian, to learn from them, to bring my ideas alongside theirs, and hopefully offer a better constructive vision um, of what American Christianity can look like.
So, something that I'm really enjoying about your work is your focus on the local and the small that is surrounding us. Like anybody that reads current events these days knows that we're just bombarded by so many big issues from all over the world, and it's really kind of a deluge in almost like hopelessness as well. But your work is so cool because like I often find myself thinking, what can I actually do about all this crazy things that I'm seeing around me?
Yeah.
And the answer is very little. But what can I do? I can control what's in my immediate vicinity, which is why whenever I saw your book, Becoming Neighbors, The Common Good Made Local from Erdman's, I was so excited about this because it does focus on the hyper local. So tell me a little bit about the origin of this project, because it's really cool.
Yeah, I mean, so much of it was born out of just my own experiences, primarily of unbelonging, of being in spaces where the proposed vision of the common good didn't include me, uh, and asking, well, what does that mean? Is that a truly common good? Uh, Also, I think as I became more politically involved and engaging more with uh, what thought leaders and politicians are saying, there is often um, this invoking of the common good as this universal thing that we all agree on. But in almost every case, it really just meant what's good for us, what's good for whatever audience that person is talking to. Um, and I think the common good is such a far more rich concept, and reality that we can live into than this platitude that just kind of glosses over all of the differences that we have as if we all agree on what good is. Um, and so the book really arose out of this combination of my experience of not being included in a vision of the common good, uh, of seeing people kind of appropriate or use the term just in semi-meaningless ways, and wanting to offer a more constructive vision of what that could look like. And the solution that's rooted, in my reading of the scriptures and the Christian tradition is that this doesn't begin with these broad universal strokes of, the common good is that everyone should be a Christian. Like, sure, that could be nice. And also, what does Jesus do when in the incarnation he comes to a deeply local place, incarnates God's self into a community with people, joins with disciples and with others, and develops a following and lives out of a reality that he is God. Um, and I think that's a vision of the common good that we ought to cultivate, that begins in the neighborhood, that begins with walking across the street and talking to your neighbor and trying to find something good between the two of you. Because if that can't be done, if we're unwilling to even know our neighbors or our own city or develop an idea of what might be good for all of us, then my question is, what are we doing trying to propose a common good for our entire nation, let alone our entire world? Um, and I think those two things are still connected, that, what we see happening on a global scale and on a national scale impacts our communities. And so it is important to pay attention to those things, um, but not for the sake of bolstering the impending sense of doom that I think a lot of us feel, uh, but instead to say, this affects my neighbors, this affects the businesses in my community, this affects the folks who, don't have a place to live. Uh, this affects my Muslim neighbors, my Jewish neighbors, my Hindu neighbors. Um, and so Yeah, the focus on a common good begins with this practice of loving your neighbors, which I think is, central to the Christian tradition alongside loving God.
Hmm. So I'm going to give you a scenario here. You're walking through a convention center with some scholars at a conference, right? And you're talking to somebody next to you, just making some normal chit chat. And you tell them you have this book out, and they're like, "Oh, tell me about the book." Give readers a preview of what they'll find in this book if you were talking to like a colleague or a friend.
Yeah, this book offers a deeply local vision of the common good that's rooted in the practice of neighbor love. I ask in the book essentially, what will we be to each other if the world doesn't end? If after years and years of seemingly saying the most vitriolic and hostile things, increasing polarization, fighting against one another. What if the world doesn't end and we have to live together? If we have to share the same grocery store, uh, pickleball league, if our kids are in this, in the same, flag football, tournament, um, what will we be to each other? Um, and so out of that futural vision is a response to say we live as neighbors. We live as those who are joined together in a shared community and who ought to be invested in the flourishing of others, even simply because it involves our own flourishing, that our lives are deeply bound up and interconnected. And I draw from uh, one of my favorite books of the past decade is Jamie Smith's How to Inhabit Time, which is this really beautiful kind of, he plays a lot on Heidegger, but this really beautiful vision of the contingency and creaturehood of humanity, that we don't exist outside or above time, but that we're thrown into it. Um, and tossed by the waves of cause and effect. And that means that we are deeply tied to our neighbors, and that their flourishing is bound to ours. And so the book is a constructive vision of how we might go about doing that, not in a prescriptive way, because I think in the spirit of deep things being deeply local, uh, I don't know your neighbor. Your neighbors are different than my neighbors. Your neighborhood is different than my neighborhood. And at the same time, I think the church, the Christian tradition, has longstanding practices of neighbor love, um, that can help us do this work well, that can move from the idea of loving our neighbors to actually getting on the ground and doing that. And so the book is a short proposal, to encourage Christians to begin thinking about the flourishing of our neighborhoods, of our cities, our states, our entire nation through the practice of neighbor love.
What is neighbor love? Give us some practical examples of what this looks like in your vision.
Yeah, I offer a few practices in the book, um, and there's some, I think are like the tried and true expressions, like the parable of the Good Samaritan in Luke 10, and I think compassion is a deep example of neighbor love. And I keep that section fairly short because we've all heard probably one or two too many sermons on the Good Samaritan over our lifetime. And so, but I say if folks know anything about this story, it's that, Samaritans in the Jewish community are very hostile and at odds towards one another. And three things that the neighbor loving compassion that's shown in this parable, um, is that the Samaritan tends to the needs of someone who was hurt by something that was outside of his control, and yet feels a call to act, and to respond to that neighbor love is often stranger love. That we're often loving people who we don't know their names, we don't know who they are, and yet we see a need before us and we meet it. Uh, and the last is that neighbor love is often enemy love. And that Jesus, in setting up the Samaritan as the protagonist in the story, challenges his Jewish audience to not only ask, can I love my neighbor, but can I imagine my neighbor loving me back? Can I imagine my enemy loving me back? Um, so I uplift that. I uplift humility as a practice of neighbor love that's rooted again in the incarnation, Christ self-emptying, to take on the form uh, of humanity, and to, as you talked about earlier, enter into the waves of cause and effect that God set in motion, um, and to enter them so intimately that he's even put to death because of them.
Mm.
But then I also uplift kind of some more, I suppose, common practices, but I put new language on it. And so I talk about translation as a practice of neighbor love. Translation following in kind of the the tradition of George Limbeck, who says that Christianity is a language, it's a vocabulary. And so to introduce others to um, this vocabulary, this perceptive lens of how we speak about and understand and speak of the world, um, is to introduce others to a new language and to translate events that we see in the world of what's happening around us and saying, oh, I see God present in this. I think that the Spirit is moving in this. I also talk about Paul Farmer and the practice of accompaniment, which grows out of his relationship with Gustavo Gutierrez, and this deep liberationist commitment that God is on the side of the poor and the oppressed, that he shows a preferential option for them. Uh, and Paul Farmer takes that up radically. And through his work as a medical professional and practitioner, um, builds a state-of-the-art hospital in Haiti in a place and time that people said it couldn't be done, or simply didn't want that to be done or saw it not as worth their time. And now his organization, Partners in Health, has done that across the world. But this practice of accompaniment um, is is akin to the language of companion, which is that Farmer says that his role as a healer is not simply to see an ailment and meet it and then go on with his day in this kind of very transactional way. But he says, I accompany you on your journey. I walk with you through this process, knowing that healing isn't this immediate thing that is, something has gone wrong and we fix it, but that this is a process of living. And he said, I'm going to join you on that journey. Uh, and I think that's a deep practice of neighbor love, to not only see folks in our community and say, oh, here's, some food, here's, something I can give you in this moment. But let's join together as neighbors and walk together, accompany one another um, through the trials of our lives. And so, yeah, there's some common practices that I uplift, and then there's also practices that I try to draw inspiration from uh, theologians and scholars and practitioners, who I think exemplify neighbor love in really beautiful ways.
Yeah, that's a great example. And if anybody hasn't ever read Mountains Beyond Mountains by Tracy Kidder about the life of Paul Farmer and his work in Partners in Health, what an amazing book. So I'm really glad that you brought that example up, because one of my favorite books I ever read when I was like a 22-year-old going into the world and wanting to make a difference in the world. And then another thing, the enemy love thing is really fascinating too. I have a neighbor where I live here in New York that flies a Confederate flag and has like gun posters and stuff all in their yard. So every single day when I'm like walking the dog, I have to walk past his house, like proudly displaying Confederate imagery in New York as well. And so that's a really interesting thing too, because I have such a negative reaction every time I see that house. And, so this is something for me as well to think about, with the enemy love aspect of neighbor love too.
Yeah, no, it's challenging. I feel the same way in my own neighborhood. It's really hard to do. It's something, you know, I aspirationally am trying to live into more. But yeah, I feel that the tension of that too, of like, it's the point of the parable. Is like, it is really difficult to imagine that.
Yeah. Okay, so tell me a little bit about your views on public scholarship as well. You started this entire conversation saying that you're a public scholar, which is really cool, and you're a part of the Sacred Rights public scholarship program. Why do you think it matters for scholars to get their work into the public sphere?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's often like this divide between the public and the academy, as if these two things don't have something to benefit from the other. Uh, Much of my work, I mean, I've been writing since around 2019, and so I was in my early years of seminary when I began publishing things publicly and getting some bylines. And a commitment that I've just always had is what Brooke from Sacred Rights calls socializing knowledge, which I love that language.
Great.
Um, which is simply to say that there's often this like explicit or implicit gatekeeping that happens, that there's this, this higher knowledge, this deep philosophy, these academic conversations that we have that are so much more sophisticated and astute than, the common conversation on the street. And we're going to hide that in the academy and put it behind the paywall of a tuition, or a conference fee or academic membership. And I think that's just the worst thing that we could do. And so much of my work is really trying to take these lofty, heady theologians and scholars that honestly the most people would not be interested in reading, or would try to and would really struggle through it because they're heavy with jargon and big ideas that are interrelated to other thinkers, and so it's just a headache to get through. Um, but taking things out of those thinkers and applying it to a broader context, and so I this is also a very Jamie Smith thing to do, and I've taken a lot of. He does this in a really expansive way with writing entire books, if not entire series about folks. Uh, I do this in a much smaller way, and so had a uh, piece on recently in Sojourners on Christian nationalism and Wittgenstein's concept of hinge propositions. That there are beliefs that we take, you know, as a hinge to move on to greater and bigger questions. And I question if Christian nationalism has become like one overarching hinge. And so that's all to say, is someone going to pick up Wittgenstein's uncertainty and read through it? Like, probably not. But this is an important concept in his philosophy, and we can take that and apply it to something like Christian nationalism to try to make sense of it. Uh, and so, yeah, I think my public scholarship is deeply rooted in trying to take, to plunder the resources of the academy and give them to the public. But also at position in the academy, bring in the voice of the public, and say, we're thinking about this idea or this thing, and we're just kind of abstractly going around hypotheticals about this or that, asking, what does this actually mean? If we put our feet on the ground, if we actually look outside the window, um, you know, the city of Chicago is not directly outside the windows of U Chicago, but to think, metaphorically about if we look outside, like what bearing does this actually have on the people around us? Um, and so that's very much like my relationship to public scholarship is to bring those two things together, the scholarly work, and the public uh, vision and emphasis.
What are some of your goals in public scholarship? What projects are you working on that you want people to maybe keep on their radar for the future?
Yeah, I mean, this book project has been a long work in progress. It's my first book, and folks who have gone through any sort of education likely know that there's at least at least in my context, there is no class. I'm like, here's how you write a book. There's also very few people who have time to say, here's how I wrote my first book. This is what you can do. And folks that through the writing process were incredibly generous with their time and advice and experience, sharing their experience. Um, and at the same time, it was a long process to get through, to get where I am now on the publishing side of things. Um, but apart from that, I've been spending more time, especially on my Substack. That's where it's the opposite of a book project in that it's right maybe do a round of edits and publish versus years of write many words, go through many rounds of editing and this and that and marketing, and then have it release. So my Substack, as a counter to this long process of a book project, has kind of been the way that I've been trying to get back into short form writing, um, and to offer some more, I suppose, like off the cuff responses, and also to respond to all the things that are happening in the world today, again, through this deep commitment to a local common good and a constructive vision of how Christians might live together in a deeply pluralistic society. And so I'd say, yeah, the big project in 2026, apart from all the book things, is getting my Substack, is called This Common Life, um, back up to a more regular basis, and yeah, sharing some more thoughts there.
Excellent. Well, let's plug the book again, Becoming Neighbors, The Common Good Made Local, from Eerdmans, and the Substack. What's the link for the Substack if people want to follow along?
Yeah, it's amardpeterman.substack.com.
Amazing. Amar, do you have any other things that you'd like for the listeners to know out there before we bring this in for a landing today?
Yeah, I mean, I say today is a great day to love your neighbor. Find a way to do that, whether it's small or large. And if you're struggling to think of how you might do that, then perhaps this is a book to pick up to help you on your way.
Well, I'll tell you how you've inspired me today. So when we just got a huge snowstorm here in Buffalo last night, and when I go out and do my snow blowing, because I have a huge snow blower, I'll hit the houses on either side of me and make sure that my neighbor across from me, who has a small kid, has the edge of their driveway unburied. So that's my little inspiration that I'm taking away from our conversation today.
Amazing. I love it.
Well, Amar Peterman, thank you so much for joining me to chat on classical ideas. I'm really excited about your book, Becoming Neighbors, The Common Good Made Local. I think it's really important in this age of big picture chaos on the global stage in news. How can we bring it back down to those that you can see in your day-to-day life right around you? Amar, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.